The Mechanical Services Company. Trusted, proven, preferred for all mechanical systems, heating and air. Our team has got you covered. Maintenance, service, installs and repair. Call us when you need comfort. Online at tmschvac.com. The Mechanical Services Company. Trusted, proven, preferred.
What is a warrior? At Portersville Christian School, it's more than a team name. A warrior is taught to serve, to passionately model the love of Christ toward neighbor, community, and world, to learn as they cultivate academic excellence and a lifelong love of learning from kindergarten to senior year, and to lead through Christian character and integrity. Are you a warrior? Discover Portersville Christian School, just 15 minutes north of Cranberry, where warriors are made, at ourpcs.org.
Marriage rates are down, birth rates are down. How does the church look at singleness? How does the church engage with people who are delaying marriage? Anna Broadway is back with us. Anna's been a guest on our show over the years. She's the author of Sexless in the City, a memoir of reluctant chastity. She's working a book on singleness research, but here today to talk about a better theology of singleness and relationship. Anna, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. It's good to be back.
Sure. Always glad to have you, Anna. This is an interesting subject. So let me start with this. If marriage is on the decline, what do you think that means for singles?
Well, it depends on a lot of factors that we don't really know. You know, sometimes that could mean that people are continuing to be in relationships where maybe they're cohabiting.
Right, but not marrying.
Right. It could be the case that Christian women are choosing not to marry somebody who's not a Christian, and because there are more women in the church, they're staying single. In some parts of the world, you know, unfortunately, in the Ukraine and Russia right now, a lot of men are dying in the war, and that's going to leave a lot of women single or widowed. So there's lots of different reasons for it. But they're not always bad reasons, as the two books I recently reviewed show.
So talk about some of the positives. So not just positive reasons why it's happening, but maybe unintended consequences.
Yeah, well, you know, when I was doing some of my research on the global experience of singleness, I met some Christians who had this sense of devoting themselves to seeking God's kingdom in a way that left open what that might look like. And what was really interesting was a man I spoke with in Nashville, Peter Volk, talked about this idea of maybe devoting yourself to certain issues in our world, whether it's education and trying to ensure that more kids get a better education, or maybe you care about social justice and criminal justice reform. But what was really interesting about that was he wasn't necessarily talking about traditional Christian ministry, but this idea that secular work done from a missional perspective could be a very important and valuable way of seeking God's kingdom and trying to make the world more look like what God intends.
And go into that a little further. Secular work done in a what way?
In a missional way.
Yeah.
What would that look like?
Well, when I was at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, they had a really great Center for Faith and Work. They had a lot of different cohorts that helped people think about how can your work be a way of honoring God.
Yes.
And there's a really interesting book, Kingdom Calling, that came out a few years ago that talked about different approaches. Yeah. So sometimes people see their work as a way to share the gospel with others. And sometimes people want to be very ethical in their work and maybe want to be a person of integrity and hope that that's a witness. But there can also be, as I think it's Amy Sherman talks about in Kingdom Calling, really significant ways that the shape of your work seeks God's kingdom. There was an example in that book of housing builders who developed a a plot of houses, and they were very deliberate about building them in different sizes so that there would be more income diversity in this neighborhood by the nature of the design. And they did some other things, but they wanted to have tax base for the schools that would be needed for this housing development. And so it was just really interesting, all of the ways that they approached how they were doing their very work and the kind of designs they were building, thinking, how can we make this a better place for our community and try to honor God's values? And so for some people, that leads them into secular work, and they don't end up having a relationship. Obviously, a job is not at odds with a relationship, but, sometimes God may call us to be fully committed to something.
To work, right. That's interesting. So, marriage is important, of course, and so less people are getting married. What about the church? I mean, can the church somehow, if there's an intentionality, if people are building homes to create a neighborhood, obviously many different minds from many different professions went into this. So the church somehow, if we're trying to build a church that builds families and has marriage at the middle of it, or singleness, to honor singleness, then why do we miss the mark? I mean, why aren't there more minds, more conversations, more emotion, more thought put into this, into the church, that marriage is valuable and it is a good end game to have, especially when, the secular world sort of scoffs at marriage and sort of turns away from it? I'm sure you've thought about that.
Yeah. Well, I would disagree with you a little bit. I don't think marriage should be at the center. I think God's kingdom should be at the center.
Yes.
And I think if that were true, that we would not be thinking about growing the church by procreation and having children. We would be more concerned about growing the church through proclamation, which is how we see the church growing in the New Testament. And so that's where I think we would start to think more about how can we seek the flourishing of our communities and our neighborhoods, and what are different ways that we are engaging and building relationships with our neighborhoods, and maybe helping people connect with and have a positive experience with the church that they haven't. And that's where I think John Van Epp and I believe it's J.P. DeGance in their book Endgame have some really practical suggestions for how churches can do relationship ministries that would offer training and coaching and support for families in the whole community, not just families in the church. And they have some really interesting research about how that helped reduce the divorce rate in some communities that JP's organization worked in.
That's good.
Anna Broadway's with us, author of Sexless in the City and memoir of Reluctant Chastity, currently working on a book based on her singleness research. We'll talk about that in a bit. Anna, for people who, I don't mean to paint with too broad a brush, but it seems, but by me saying that, that's what I'm about to do. So it's kind of it's like a useless, it's kind of a non sequitur. But anyway, a lot of churches today almost exist based on their youth ministry and their marriage ministry. And it seems like, okay, well, Sunday worship, Bible study, whatever else kind of comes behind. Like if you're really committed, you might get into those things. But what's going to draw you to the church is either the marriage ministry or the youth group. And to me, I've been on a church staff for a long time. I've started to kind of question our priority in that area, just simply because it leaves whole swaths of our community untouched or uninvited almost.
Right.
Or even unnoticed or, And so in thinking through those things over the last, few years and talking to a number of my friends who are single, it's made me realize that I think a lot of people who are married tend to look at people who are single in a transactional basis. Like, wow, well, since you have you must have a lot of free time, so you could serve in this capacity.
Oh, because you're not married and you don't have kids.
Exactly.
Oh, wait.
In the church. Now, do you think I'm exaggerating in that way?
Well, I think married people and singles often don't know how to be friends with each other.
Okay.
And I'll talk more about this in my book, but we often have this kind of dating approach to our friendships where the way that you meet up is you get together for coffee or a meal or something like that. And married people usually have very little time left over in the month for that kind of activity.
Right.
But where I've seen the richest friendships happen is where, you know, when I was in the Bay Area last fall, I asked a friend, does anybody need to go to Costco? And maybe that's how we meet up. We go to Costco together, you know, or maybe you say to a single friend, hey, I've got to be at my kid's softball game, but I'd love to catch up with you. Do you want to come? Or, you know, I see my pastor in California, he and his wife have really invited this one single man into their family life. And so one day the wife and kids went over and helped him clean his apartment. He was struggling with that, you know, or they just had him over for a dinner that wasn't anything special on their part, but they just said, hey, we're doing this. You're welcome to join us.
Right.
And so I think friendship becomes deeper when we're willing to be more vulnerable and when we open up our errands and chores as spaces where we can interact with each other. I think there's a lot more time and it leads to a more meaningful conversation.
That's good. So instead of, as a married person, looking at a single person as a project, hey, you know, you need to meet somebody that I know and let me try to think about my friends that you might connect with. Just meet people where they are.
Sure. And the other thing, too, is single people need relationships with your children. If we don't have children of our own, who is our family? Who are the children in our lives? Sometimes that only happens because of married couples that invite us into their families.
Years ago, when I was dating my wife, she was not a believer. And one Sunday morning, there was, you know, the signs, it's like a Saturday weekend, signs around the neighborhood. Hey, a pancake breakfast on Sunday morning. Now, my wife, who would not really gladly go into a church, was somehow oddly fascinated by the idea of a pancake breakfast. And so instead of us going to worship, she didn't want to go in the sanctuary. She gladly went into the church basement and hung out. And the cool thing was, I mean, this was, you know, decades ago, the pancake breakfast was run by a group of Christian singles. And you know what? It was cool. And it was quirky and it was funny. And, you know,
it was low pressure?
It was low pressure. I remember, like, for me, wanting to say, you know, here's how the church works. Like, wanted to go upstairs and somehow be involved in some, you know, pastoral discussion, or there's a sermon. What we discovered in the basement was the church worked really differently in the basement than it worked upstairs. And what we found downstairs was it was cool. And I think in some ways, now I can't speak for her, it opened the door for her to relax and to find her way upstairs because of a group of quirky singles.
Right.
So I appreciate that church. We didn't go to that church, but they saw some value there, right? And
provided a way of entrance, right? And I guess that's that on-ramp I was talking about, Anna, with, you know, youth ministry or marriage ministry.
Sure.
Those are easy on-ramps for people who have kids or are married. But, you know, I don't think probably our on-ramp is as easy for other people groups.
Yeah, and I think that's something that would take a lot of prayer and discernment about your community and where God wants to move. But, like, for example, I'm thinking about the church I go to currently, and one thing, they open their space to a lot of different organizations.
Okay.
So there are a lot of people in the community who are coming through not to go to church, but they're at least familiar with it as a space. Maybe they have a choir practice there. But then they also host a farmer's market on summer Saturdays. And they've got a book discussion group. And, you know, I'm thinking about those things. Like, the farmer's market is a great opportunity to advertise certain things to people who might live in the neighborhood, you know. And I think there's a hunger to connect, especially after COVID. And even, like, the softball team that I'm on, there are multiple people on the, quote, church softball team who I don't even know how they're connected to it. But if that's a way for them to have a little bit of connection with the church, that's a really positive thing, because then maybe they would be more open to an invitation to an Easter service or something, or maybe they would see that church or that friend as a resource if a crisis comes up where they sense a need for spiritual help.
Yeah. That's really good. I mean, the church, from a secular worldview, has such a black eye for a lot of people, right? I mean, people who would never go into church and think, oh, those Christians, and then fill in the blank. So there's got to be a way to be winsome, and especially with all the resources that are there, boy. Greater minds, I think, than mine, and maybe yours,
and mine,
could try to figure this out and make an entranceway, that on-ramp that you're talking about. And singles are in the front of that in some way. That'd be really cool.
Anna, tell us about your new book.
Yeah, so I am working on a book for NAV Press that will hopefully come out in fall 2023, and it's based on the 17 months of field work I spent interviewing more than 300 Christians around the world.
Cool.
I did almost all of the interviews in person and spoke with people from about 40 countries for that project.
Listen, that was hearing you talk about that trip and
what a journey.
It was just fabulous. So I cannot wait for the book. I bet you can't wait for the book to be done too.
Well, I'm grateful that when I sit down and write, God often meets me in very unexpected ways in the process. And that's a gift.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to focus on the end result and overlook the process in a lot of things. But I'm grateful that I feel like I'm meeting him in the process, in the journey of getting to the final book.
Fabulous. We've met you because of this journey, so count us as part of that with you. Thanks an awful lot for that, Anna.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's Anna Broadway. Check out her other book, Sexless in the City, a memoir of reluctant chastity. And stay tuned as we talk with Anna regularly about the things she's working on right now.
Excellent. Anna Broadway, easily found online, of course. Take a quick break. It's our daily feature. Does this make sense?
Last year, over 100,000 people in the United States died from drug overdoses, and alcohol-related deaths are rising.